Preparing the live stream. And we're on. When you're ready, Curtis.
Thank you, Madam President. Good evening, viewers, and welcome to Democratic Labour Party's Facebook Live program, Sunday Roast. I am Curtis Kiv, attorney at law. Apologies. I am Curtis Kiv, an attorney at law. I'm former president of the Young Democrats, the youth forum of the Democratic Labour Party, and I will be your moderator for today's program. First, let me wish all the viewers who are mothers a happy and healthy Mother's Day. In this evening's program, we will be discussing the topic Integrity Matters and Good Governance for a Prosperous Barbados. I am joined by a panel of two, Ms. Verla de Peiza, the president of the Young Democrats, an attorney at law and a spokesperson for finance issues for the Democratic Labour Party. My next guest is Mr. Andy Armstrong, the chairman of Integrity Group Barbados and the managing director of Armstrong Manufacturing Limited. Before we go any further, I invite the president, de Peiza, to give a few words and welcome to our viewers and brief comments. Mr. Peiza.
Thank you very much, Curtis, and thank you very much for all of you who have joined us. Now, for several years, I will go so far as to say decades, Barbados has been having conversations with itself in relation to getting new legislation on board governing how our public servants conduct themselves. There is legislation in place. It is almost 100 years old, and simply by stating that, we will know that it is simply not fit for purpose in terms of the realities that we meet today. We have had several forays into change. The last administration brought a bill, it was passed, but it never was signed into law by the Governor General. And then this present administration, they also brought a bill which passed the House, but very surprisingly, I think the entire country was flummoxed by the fact that it failed in the Senate. Recent events, though, surrounding our own comrade and former minister, Dontville Inniss, has brought into sharp relief that we really do need to have structure in Barbados, not just surrounding how we conduct ourselves as public servants, but also how parties are financed, because let's be real, that is one of the offshoots of not having any structure in how we manage money in the public service. Elections have to be financed. We're pretty clear on that, but we need to have rules and regulations on how it is done so that we don't have the allegations and the rumors of abuse. Also, that we do not have a fostering of an environment that is even suggestive, never mind having any concrete proof, but just being suggestive of something other than strict business practices is what we need to get away from. And it is not just about being able to manage our affairs here in Barbados, but it is also about the face that we show to the world, because at the end of the day, we play on the world market. We coax businesses to Barbados, and they have to be comfortable about the environment that they're coming to operate within. So it is not just about us as locals and who we bring on board to represent us, but it is also about the face of Barbados that we show to the world. And that is the conversation that the Democratic Labour Party wants to open up. We don't want it to lag, because we are in another week or so, we would be at 3 years of this present administration, 2 years until elections are due again. And this is a conversation that we need to be having now before the next round of elections. We have sufficient time that we can put the legislation in place in time for the next round of elections so that we can say with some confidence, even if not, I mean, legislation is not perfect, and you can't, it is not just about having legislation in place, it will also be about enforcing the legislation, but at least it will be a step in the right direction, and we will be showing the country that we are serious about making change and doing business differently going forward.
Thank you, Madam President. Firstly, let me welcome again for those of you who are now joining us. This is the Democratic Labour Party Sunday Roast, and we are discussing this evening Integrity Matters, Good Governance for a Prosperous Barbados. For many viewers, you are wondering, what is this talk about integrity? For regional academics, integrity is about understanding, accepting, and choosing to behave in accordance with the established good principles, which would include honesty, fairness, and decency. So traditionally, how do Barbadians view integrity in public life? Culturally, in the Barbadian context, there is an understanding and an acceptance within the public that persons who hold public office ought to behave in a way that they use the public office to the benefit of the general society and not themselves. As relates to the economy, when there are lapses in the public sector integrity, the economic impact is felt throughout the society. This is particularly the case regarding the distribution of public resources. When activities such as corruption exist, the resources within the public space is funneled towards personal interests as opposed to the public good. So why is this important, and why are we discussing today and right now? For one of the signature plaques of the Barbados Labour Party government election coming into the last election was the issue of integrity. We have seen both the Democratic Labour Party and the Barbados Labour Party government's attempts to bring integrity laws that have ultimately, quite frankly and fairly, failed to pass in Parliament. In recent times, the Barbados Labour Party government would have been looking towards a prevention of corruption bill, and they have asked various groups to contribute towards the formation of the said bill. It is therefore important that the Democratic Labour Party makes its case known regarding its position on matters of integrity for the party and the country going forward. Now, our guest, Mr. Armstrong, is here with us, so I'm going to open the floor to you shortly. So now that I've put integrity, the context in Barbadian context, I now open the floor to our guest, Mr. Armstrong, and ask you to share your perspective as it relates to integrity in Barbados, the perspective of the integrity group in which you lead, and the state of integrity in Barbados. Mr. Armstrong?
Thank you, Curtis, and thank you, Madam Peiza, for inviting me onto the program. And of course, happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. I hope some of you have managed to tune into this program this evening. So just a quick background on the Integrity Group Barbados. We're an apolitical, open, voluntary grouping of citizens who are concerned with good governance. We include academics, lawyers, business people, students, and retirees. We've done a number of programs. For a long time, we had a regular column in the Sunday Sun. It's currently a bit on pause because the person who wrote most of the articles for us is too busy, but we do hope to restart articles again by around mid-year. We've had a town hall. We've also had a joint meeting with the Chamber of Commerce, with Rotary. So we've tried to get the message out there. And most recently, in December last year, we had a joint Zoom session with the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Barbados, and we had the Attorney General speak to us, and we had well over 300 people tune in for that. So I think that just shows you the level of interest in integrity in Barbados. And I think, as Curtis said, in the last election, the whole matter of integrity was very high on the political platform. And the current administration made a number of promises to bring integrity legislation. They have done so to a degree. We certainly a little frustrated. We hope they can step up the pace as well. Like many, we were very surprised when the last bill failed in the Senate, but I know they're planning to bring that back. And the integrity group has done submissions. I know one of the submissions we felt was that judges should be included in that legislation. That one is, I guess that is the integrity in public life. And then of course, right now we're looking at the Prevention of Corruption 2021. And even though I'm in the field, I can tell you sometimes it gets a little confusing because there seem to be so many bills that are dealing with different aspects of integrity. But the prevention of corruption is a very important one. We also are very keen, there's a procurement bill somewhere. Don't know if it's a select committee exactly, but that one is important. And a lot of people single in on contractor general and feel that if we had a contractor general that would clean up a lot of the, let's say, insinuations that perhaps contracts are not given out in the correct way. But the procurement bill looks at a position that's similar to a contractor general. So hopefully that could address some of those issues. And of course, for us, what's very important is freedom of information. And, you know, I went to see how Barbados ranked on freedom of information. Well, we don't actually rank because we haven't adopted the Freedom of Information Charter, and that in itself is embarrassing. So I think that is one that is definitely very overdue. As you know, in Barbados, often it is very difficult to really know exactly what is going on. And I think actually that often works against the party in power, because what people imagine often, I'm sure, is a lot worse than what the actual situation is. But when people just have no access to the true information, then, you know, the mind can go wild. So the Freedom of Information Act, we think, is very important. And lastly, well, whistleblowing, but not lastly, because I would pick up on what Verla said, campaign financing. That is, some people would argue that's the root of everything, because you would know better than I, but I hear it could cost each party upwards of $10 million to run a general election. And that's a lot of money to find. And you want to be sure that the persons who donate that money are not doing so expecting to get something in return. So anyway, I'm here. I'm very glad to be here representing Integrity Group. I'm looking forward to the discussion tonight.
Thank you so very much, Andy. You would have touched on a number of issues which we plan to discuss, campaign financing among one of them. I now open the floor to Ms. Peiza, the President of the Democratic Labour Party, on your views and your perspective on integrity in Barbados and ultimately the views of the Democratic Labour Party.
Thank you. Now, the first thing that I want to do is to set parameters, because the conversation in Barbados has centered around candidates and MPs, but the reality of how business and politics is structured in Barbados is that despite what people think, MPs have zero access to the public purse in any direct way. It is civil servants, especially civil servants at the higher end of the scale, who actually touch in any meaningful way the monies that are in the consolidated fund and in the treasury. So any legislation that we're looking at has also to speak to our public servants, and certainly both iterations, that of the last administration and the failed one of the present administration, contemplated senior civil servants and senior political players besides, and maybe I should say, including members of parliament. But what that means is that besides those sitting in the two houses, it also contemplated permanent secretaries and other senior civil servants, chairmen and members of boards. It was wide enough. It wasn't wide enough to cover the judiciary, and I do believe that we need to be including them, especially now that we have a different system of selecting them. It was bad enough when it was just the prime minister on consultation with the leader of the opposition, but we have a vetting process now, but we still have to be careful that there is not any judicial influence, especially as Barbados looks towards its commercial enterprises and the fact that we just set up a commercial court. So businesses in large measure will be looking towards the judiciary for guidance, and we need to be very clear not only about the autonomy of the judiciary, but also that the judiciary remains unscathed when we speak about impropriety of any type. So the first thing that I wanted to make clear is that it is not just members of parliament that we are looking to bring under the umbrella and to cover with integrity. Matter of fact, I constantly make the point that integrity truly cannot be legislated. That has to be something that is innate. But at the end of the day, because you are operating on a visible platform, a public platform, we need to ensure that if it isn't in you, that we put it on you, and that we have sufficient safeguards first, and then that we have sufficient enforcement after, in the event that anyone falls through the cracks. So we need to have that framework. And I agree with Andy, it is not a one piece of legislation, because the nature of the malfeasance, that bad influence, is such that the person who is coming forward to speak about it very likely already complied with the request for the bribe. It is hard to pin down, and I'm going to put on my lawyer hat now, because just like with most sexual offenses, they don't happen in a crowd. You're hardly going to extend or accept a bribe in a crowd. So it is a he said, she said situation. So we need to have the whistleblower legislation in place alongside the integrity legislation. We need to have the freedom of information, because that is one way that you can hide impropriety, by not having information freely available. And we need to have as many as possible fall under the umbrella. I was in Senate at a time when I heard the nervousness of some speaking to whether or not it would keep people out of the public service because of how intrusive it was. And I was seeing it in the opposite way, that coming with clean hands should make you step up to the plate in the first place. And then once you are there, you now have that added impetus to keep your hands clean. So I did not see it as a stumbling block to people coming. Yes, it does ask you to have disclosure of what you earn and what you own and what you also owe. But to my mind, that is a safeguard for you as well, because having given full disclosure of these things, then anyone claiming that there is something else put on you, you will be able to show what you came in with and what you are going out with. So I actually saw that as a safeguard as opposed to a stumbling block. We keep hearing rumor and innuendo, and it will remain in that realm if we don't give some sort of cover. And I want to just draw an analogy to a recent situation at the government industrial schools, where the lady who brought the disturbing information out lost her job over it. There was nothing to cover her, first of all, in terms of keeping her identity secret, and secondly, in terms of protecting her job security once she had done that. So she, let's face it, even if her work had not been terminated, she likely would have found it difficult to work in that environment with everybody knowing who she was and what she had done. But we needed, as a country, to know that those events were taking place against minors, because if you don't know that you have a problem, you can't take the steps to fix it. So we need to have the whistleblowers protected. We need to have their identities covered, and we need to have all of the legislation in place. And I do agree with Andy that the root, or at least in large measure, we can trace a lot of what we speak about in relation to candidates, to the state of flux that campaign finance is in right now. Anything goes. And we need to have structure, because that protects both the MP and also whomsoever it is that is subscribing. And the thing is that the way that political parties exist in Barbados is shadowy to begin with, because from the Constitution down, they are all silent as to the existence of something that has tangible representation in Barbados, to the extent that the two main political parties actually own prime real estate in Barbados. So the denying of the existence, the legal denying of the existence of political parties actually, to my mind, assists in keeping this cloak and shield around how campaigns are financed, because they are not legal entities, because they're not even properly associations. They can't earn money in any real way. So they are dependent on donations. And that opens up the can of worms. And we need to find some way to put them back inside the can, to put a label on the can, so that we know what it is we are dealing with. We need to have legal recognition of political parties alongside having campaign finance rules. And then for those instances which hopefully we would have whittled down to the bare minimum, for those instances where there is breach, that the people speaking up in relation to the breach do not find themselves victimized as well. So it is an entire web that is very, very intermeshed, interlinked, and we need to deal with it all. And we can't lose the opportunity now of it being topical. We need to deal with it now.
Thank you so very much, Andy and Verla. We would have touched on what I would have planned going forward, the pieces of legislation which we find necessary at this stage, because we would have acknowledged that some of them is pretty much ineffective at this stage, and we need additional laws to support the current laws. So I'm going to go back to you, Andy, pretty much for you to tell me, let's zoom in pretty much on the laws. Looking at possible 3 additional pieces of acts, laws that could be added to the current laws, and why, going into a little bit more detail, why do we need these particular pieces? I know Verla would touch on the whistleblowing and use to some extent, but walk us through it for the viewers who, indeed, the average Barbadian want to know about the whistleblowing and these additional laws and why they are necessary to complement the current laws that we have.
Okay, thank you, Curtis. Well, I think on the whistleblower, Verla addressed that quite well. You want to give the whistleblower protection because a lot of times, as she said, when corruption happens, it happens in the dark. But sometimes, you know, if it happens within a company, there could be somebody lower down the line who kind of knows what's going on. And if they can leak that information to the authorities in an anonymous way, then often you can then get action. So I think the protection of the individual is why whistleblowing is so important. The freedom of information, we believe, is a very important one as well. And there's also been a movement to open data, which a number of countries have also adopted open data, including St. Lucia. And they're kind of complementary, let's say, but the open data is one where the government undertakes to publish on their website all information that may be of interest to the public. So in my mind, it's things like you want to see who got the contract for Highway 1 and which companies bid, which ones were awarded. And again, it's our money, so I don't see any problem showing what each one bid and was awarded at. And therefore, if something looks very strange, then the public can ask questions. But sometimes just because something looks strange, there may be a perfectly good explanation. But if you don't know, then you can't ask. And that's why I think the freedom of information and open data are complementary. What I would say is most countries in the Caribbean have freedom of information. Barbados does not, and we need to get it. But I can tell you one of our colleagues in Antigua, about a couple of years ago, we were on a program on the Antigua Observer, and she was saying that she had gone to great lengths to be able to request information from a particular government department, and had taken about 3 years before someone was even identified who could give her the information. And she'd been waiting about 8 years since then to get the information. So it's that often, I think in Barbados, we have too many laws, but we just don't. We'd be better off with half the laws, but we just made sure we enforced those laws. So let's just be careful that we do that. The campaign finance, again, that was one that the current administration did say, and I know the Prime Minister has spoken in public, recognizing that that is a big issue and needs to be dealt with. And as Verla said, I would hope before the next election, assuming they go to the 2 years, that we would bring some kind of campaign finance legislation to the House. Just the fact, as Verla said, political parties are not legal entities. That doesn't seem correct. And, you know, in Barbados right now, there's a certain amount you can spend per elector in an election. And most candidates will officially spend just that amount. But anyone with common sense observing what goes on would be aware in certain constituencies a lot more money than that is spent. So it always makes me uncomfortable if you have, even as we do now, a law and it's just basically ignored. So one thing is, I mean, I think the amount per elector should be increased, but that is definitely something that needs looking at. I also, just throwing in something here, you're probably both aware that not too long ago, the Caribbean Court of Justice ruled on an election in Dominica that happened in 2012, so ages ago, but they found the Skerritt administration, the current one, guilty of treating, and that was by holding like a public meeting where they gave free entertainment, and that was perceived as treating. I don't know what's happened since, but I remember Mr. Astafan, who's the advisor to the government of Antigua, he made a public comment and he said all political parties in the Caribbean should pay notice because this is going to be a game changer for how campaigns are done in the future. So knowing that the CCJ has ruled that having a big party can be considered as treating, I think it really is important that we update our election laws, and we look at putting some rules and regulation in place before one or both parties finds themselves afoul of the CCJ. So just going back again, the whistleblowing, yes, freedom of information, stroke open data, and campaign finance would, for us, be three of the key ones that need to come.
Thank you so very much, Andy. All the pieces of acts which could possibly complement the existing ones. You would have mentioned, as you said, the whistleblowing, the freedom of information, open data, along with campaign financing. Mr. Peiza, as the president of the Democratic Labour Party, the Democratic Labour Party supporters would naturally see you as a prime minister in waiting. You would have mentioned previously, and pretty much in agreement with Andy, a number of pieces of legislation in which Barbados ought to have on their statute books. Can you give us three in which, in your opinion, is top priority on your list, or would be top priority on the Democratic Labour Party's list in the event that this current administration, this current Barbados Labour Party administration fails to bring them into enactment?
Thank you very much. This question actually makes me simply continue from where Andy left off, because as you would know as a lawyer, CCJ decisions are binding on all of the regions who have signed up. Barbados definitely is a signatory. Therefore, the decision against the Dominica Labour Party is binding, or should I say, against any political party, is binding across the Caribbean and definitely here in Barbados. Now, that particular case spoke to a concert. Almost every political rally in Barbados starts, if not in its entirety, is a concert. We have seen it on all sides. But alongside that, if a free concert is an issue, then we have to consider all of the other political paraphernalia that we as political parties usually generate and distribute. Bags, cups, whistles, the flags, the shirts. You know, there is so much promotional material that is put out there that if a promotional concert runs afoul of the CCJ, then we have to rethink in its entirety how we manage campaigns in Barbados. And that is why I said that this is not just a conversation that we need to have before the next election, but this is a solution that we need to find before the next election, because even the by-election in November would run afoul of the CCJ decision. So we have to pay close attention. We can't just be giving lip service to it anymore. And I may hold a lash or two, but I will say boldly that I am satisfied that Barbados has played lip service only to getting legislation in place, modern legislation, because I know I'm going to hear that we have the 1929 Act, but just simply by calling the year, you know that it has no practical relevance. No, even though the litigation in the US made reference to it, but they had to make reference to what existed, okay? But we know that it is not fit for purpose. But we are under the umbrella of the CCJ, and that decision is binding on Barbados. So we need, as a matter of urgency, to craft a path that does not collide us with that CCJ decision. And we need to be purposeful about it. So not having it pass both houses of parliament and not proclaiming it, and most assuredly not counting seats to make sure that you have enough people, warm bodies in seats and votes, because we know that you can micromanage that situation, because we saw it happen just a few weeks ago when not enough were available for the vote in relation to the extension of the emergency powers, and they could scramble and fill that breach in a short space of time. So we know that it can be done if there is sufficient political will. And I will go so far as to say that the government of the day has sufficient majority that they can make these changes without the type of friction that you could get were you to have a large or even a small minority of an opposition sitting in either house. You have an absolute majority in the lower house. You have a majority in the upper house, and you have sufficient influence that you can get the required majority to pass the legislation. And not all of the pieces of legislation that we are speaking about will require a 2/3 majority in any event. What we need in Barbados is political will to fix it. And I do believe that this is sufficiently urgent because of the Dontville Inniss situation, and the fact that we know, because we have heard repeatedly, okay, that we have to do differently. And then we have been told by the CCJ that we must do things differently. We can't wait and run another election, have a disappointed MP take the matter to the CCJ to hear the exact thing again. We know that the CCJ decision is binding on us. We need to get ahead with the things that make us right in the eyes of the law, and most assuredly in the eyes of the voting public.
Thank you so very much, President Peiza. You would have labeled it as lip service, pretty much. And it's also interesting that you haven't shied away from the Dontville Inniss issue. Describing it as lip service, therefore, it means that both political parties since the early 1990s would not have been able to pass effectively any law to pretty much complement the existing law to enforce a level of integrity in Barbados. Mr. Peiza, I'm coming back at you with this particular question because I know that you are very, as quote unquote, sweet on the campaign financing and the need for the laws. Given the importance of these pieces of legislation, what it is that both administrations, pretty much both Democratic Labour Party and the Barbados Labour Party, haven't been able to enforce such laws? Okay,
before I answer that, let me be clear on what I said just now, okay? Dontville Inniss's misfortune impacts the whole of Barbados. It is not a Democratic Labour Party issue. So there's no need for us to shy away from it. It is a Barbados issue, and we can fix it. We just need to have the will to fix it, which then brings me to your question. The harsh reality is that both political parties have been the beneficiaries of the lacuna. Having that gap has worked for both. Let's just be frank. Both parties benefit from having undisclosed support from undisclosed entities, whether individuals or companies or enterprises. And in some cases, I have heard countries, but whichever way it is, both today benefited. But we now have two cases, one local, one regional, which say to us, you cannot do things the way you used to do them. You must do it differently. And when you look at the definition of treating, because this case was about effect, but it spoke about providing food, drink, entertainment during or after an election, you know, so it is sufficiently wide, the definition in the CCJ decision, that covers a picnic sponsored by the party. You know, we really do have to think about how it is we are going to manage campaigns going forward. This is not a flippant discussion. This is not because the Democratic Labour Party is not getting the subvention. This is not because things are different in Barbados with one party having, that's not even a majority, having all. This is about reality in the legal world and how we now have to play according to the rules. And we do not have an excuse anymore of either not knowing or of turning a blind eye. Both cases publicly reported, and we have to extract the lessons from it, extrapolate. We don't even have to go too far to find the examples. Antigua has legislation in place. Trinidad had legislation in place so long that the Prime Minister who piloted it was the very first to be snagged by it, and that was Pandey. Okay, so we have examples around us already. So there is no, we don't have to sit down now and carve it out. We may have to polish it to suit a Barbadian context, but it is not so hard to do in a 2-year span. We made it a 2-year span, but this was mission critical for this administration. They started it immediately upon coming to office and then dragged their feet on it, rushed it at the point of the prorogation, and I can't say it's an unnecessary prorogation of Parliament, but most certainly we have not seen any about face that suggested we needed a new throne speech and turn a new chapter. But what we know for sure is that the platform, the playing field is not what it used to be. And we do not have the excuse, regardless of what our reasons were before, for creating legislation and not proclaiming it, or creating a bill and dragging it across the floor, I have to say, because it never saw the light of day. What whatever the reasons were, I don't even know that we need to analyze them in any significant way. What we need to do going forward is to be purposeful about putting the right things in place so that by the time of the next elections, we are addressing those glaring issues that have been shown up for us.
Thank you, Mr. Peiza. You're going to go and give a chance for Andy to follow up on that particular question. What is it that you believe that politicians and parliamentarians weren't able up to this time, I believe over 100 years or so, weren't able to pass legislation and acts which would pretty much complement and enforce harder policies and on corruption and integrity?
Well, I'm not sure why, but I guess you have to know that there are certain politicians out there who are very keen on integrity and good governance. And there are others who, for whatever reason, may not be so keen because maybe they feel it ties their hands to some degree. So I could just surmise that within the current administration, not everyone is fully on board with the need for integrity legislation. Coming out of that aspect though, I know the Attorney General has been trying to set up an anti-corruption unit because he recognizes that the Royal Barbados Police Force already is under-resourced, but they also don't have enough people who have the skills or the training or the space to actually look for corruption and try to prosecute it. I think everyone would remember he was, I think on TV, certainly was on the front page, pretty much begging the Commissioner of Police to start a case against Dontville Inniss. But he made the point that he is not able to direct the Commissioner of Police what to do. This goes back a few years. But so the Attorney General might feel a certain way. But again, the Commissioner of Police or the Director of Public Prosecutions are the ones, really the Director of Public Prosecutions is the one who has to bring the case. And they may not have the resources. So the idea of having a standalone anti-corruption unit whose sole purpose is to try to root out corruption, I think is a great idea. He had originally hoped to have this in place by December 2019. They just missed that date, and then COVID came along, and it's clear that the focus has gone behind COVID, and this has been put on the back burner. But again, I know he has stated a number of times that for him it's very important to get that anti-corruption unit up and running, and I would just make a plea out there to the House to find the money to get a proper anti-corruption unit up and running. Because even though we have a 1929 law, which is very deficient, I bet a really determined prosecutor would be able to prosecute someone under that law. Verla may know better than I, but I remember reading it a few years ago, and it's a short law, but it's very interesting in that the burden of proof is not on the prosecution, it is on the person who is accused. So if they have reasonable grounds to accuse you that you may have taken a bribe, it's up to you to prove that you didn't. And that's pretty remarkable these days. So that alone could perhaps help. But again, I just come back to the point that it is important to have the laws in place, but it is more important, or just as important, to have a well-resourced unit that will be able to effectively implement these laws. Christopher Blackman, the head of the Employment Rights Tribunal, you may have seen in the last week, he wrote a letter to the paper, and it was pretty remarkable, but he was saying basically, they have no resources and in the Employment Rights Tribunal, and there's no place for them to meet. So they're up to the good graces of various government departments to grant them space. And, you know, that often is a problem in Barbados. We will set up an entity and we just don't give it the resources. Someone was telling me they were in court and, you know, the judge still has to write out everything in hand in that particular case. They don't even record the proceedings. So if somebody wants to go back and check the veracity of the accuracy of what was said, it's really who remembers it this way and that. So it's a consensus, and we need to use technology. This is 2021. The technology is out there. Most other countries use it. So let us just make sure that we give enough resources to any committee or unit that we set up.
Thank you, Andy. You would have mentioned the Anti-Corruption Unit, and also I think earlier you would have also mentioned the possibility of having a contractor general. Over to you, Madam President, Ms. Peiza. Where do you stand on the discussion and the debate about the concerns of government spending? And for you, is there a need for a contractor general as it relates to, there have been some discussion about the Auditor General office being understaffed? To, in Barbadian terminology, does the Auditor General needs a little bit more bite? Tell us your views, Ms. Peiza, and also the Democratic Party's views on the way forward for the Auditor General's office, if it lands in your hands, or to make a decision, that is, and also if necessary to have a contractor general and repurposing and giving the resources to these offices.
Okay, the Auditor General's reports are ordinarily the first whiff that we, the public, have that something has gone wrong in a process in a government department. The Auditor General has the right to go in and investigate on behalf of the people of Barbados. And that's it. And this is where the problem comes. I think we all know right down the line, not one administration and not another, although I can't recall seeing an Auditor General's report in the last 3 years, but the Auditor General may show infelicities, he may show bad accounting practices, he may show the department is sleeping on the job, and he will write all of that. But that is the full stop. There is no mechanism after the Auditor General's reports to actually call to account, check to make sure that the recommendations are put in place. We know if they are in the next cycle of the Auditor General's reports. But in an instance, and I think the Public Accounts Committee also bore this out, where it grabbed more at civil servants and showed glaring issues where civil servants were concerned. What it does not do is have a mechanism for discipline, a mechanism for calling to account. And that really is what is needed. There's not much point having a sword if it is blunt. It has to be sharpened. And we constantly have, and I'm thinking all the way back, we had Auditor General's reports on Lower Burney, we had Auditor General's reports, we're not coming all the way up the Transport Board. We've had Auditor General's reports with things that stand out in the minds of our people. but there they die an unnatural death because we haven't put in place a follow-up system. So just like, and only by way of anecdote to the commentary from Andy on the Attorney General asking the Commissioner of Police to bring a prosecution. I am sure the Attorney General as an attorney would know that it was really the DPP that he should have been asking that of. But outside of that, because of the nature of the matter, but outside of that, if the Auditor General does not have within his remit the referral of a matter to the police financial investigations unit, if the Auditor General does not have in his arsenal the ability to rest the file down on the DPP's desk, then all we are doing is creating hot air for political platforms, but we are not actually correcting wrongs. So if it is that, and sometimes it is simply the process that the Auditor General has a problem with. Occasionally it's missing money too. But even in relation to process, the Auditor General should have the authority to say, fix this, do it this way instead. And not just writing a report and you will see a short blurb paragraph in italics, which is a rebuttal. And it usually is very, very short. And we don't see anything going forward to suggest that the issue highlighted is addressed. It has to be a frustrating job, especially if you will go back to that same entity and find exactly what you found last time. It has to be a frustrating job because it doesn't have any bite. It doesn't have any teeth. And it is for us, the lawmakers, to give him that authority.
Thank you, President.
Yeah. Curtis, can I just
follow up?
jump in? I just want to jump in because I don't want to put myself in trouble. I believe what the Attorney General probably had said was that he didn't understand why an investigation had not been started into the Dontville Inniss case. Because of course you have to investigate before you can prosecute. But in that case, there certainly seemed to have been enough out there from the US government alone to warrant an investigation. So can I just make a point on what Verla said with the Auditor General too? Completely agree, the Auditor General, to my mind and many people, has done a sterling job in recent years in highlighting issues. But there should be more, he or she should have more power to try to affect the changes. I know this current administration, when they first came in, they had certain protocols which all the state-owned enterprises had to follow. And I know there was a lot of talk about if they didn't do certain things like annual reports, audited reports, the chairman and board of those state enterprises could face sanctions. That's gone a bit quiet. Hopefully that's because all the state-owned enterprises are now fully compliant, but I don't know. That's just throwing that one out there.
All right, thank you very much, Andy. Mr. Peiza, for clarity and for our viewers, the Democratic Labour Party is pretty much the opposition party and a government in waiting. To make it abundantly clear, are you saying, I'm going to put you on the spot here, are you saying that the Democratic Labour Party will explore the possibility of giving the Auditor General, if be elected, a little bit more, as to use your term, a little bit more bite and the power to enforce what is given, what is reported in his actual report?
Yes, Curtis, I think you the type of law that you do, you would know how a business is structured. And when an auditor reports on a private company, the fixes have to be done. The fixes have to be done. So when an auditor reports on a public entity, I think we are just as entitled to expect that the fixes must be done. So yes, that is a priority. And I do apologize because you also asked me about the contractor general. And a contractor general would assist, but a contractor general still cannot cure constantly using a rule that is intended to be an exception, but it is being used as the norm. A contractor general can't cure that because we would be forever circumventing it. And was it 319 points? I forget the exact section in the act that we keep using. We keep first, when in opposition, you complain that the government is issuing contracts under them, and then when it is your turn to be in government, you use the same loophole in order to award contracts. So having a contractor general will not cure that so long as we continue to have a loophole, because you would default to the loophole. And I think all administrations in recent times have done that. We heard it during the estimates recently coming out of the National Housing Corporation and their report. So we can put titles in place. We can have offices open. But again, like the Auditor General, if the Contractor General is not given sufficient authority to govern, not just to pronounce, but to govern, then we would simply be creating another job space, but not addressing the problem.
Thank you, Mr. Peiza. Andy, back at you. With regards to, we've been hammering away, pretty much to use that term, at the public sector and the different breaches in integrity and the corruption there, etc. With regards to the private sector, we would have spoken about campaign finances, and we know politicians don't give themselves bribes, right? You're in the private sector. What can you tell us about the private sector, or your views on the private sector role in upholding integrity in Barbados, and pretty much seeing that transactions between the government and the private sector are pretty much corruption-free?
Well, the private sector does have a huge role because, as you pointed out, any kind of corruption, it's two parties, and the corruption normally happens where the private sector intersects with the government or the public sector. And there's certain places where that can happen more than others. Now, let me just say, I believe everyone should be free to donate to any political party they want to, and I'm certainly aware of some high-profile business people that donate generously to both parties. So they want to make sure that they, let's say, support the democratic process. And I'm a firm believer in that because, you know, for all its flaws, Barbados certainly has a better process in so many places in the world, and we should be fortunate for that. But just because we have a good situation, you know, we should not mean that we don't want to make it better. So, but I do believe there needs to be declaration over a certain amount. I don't know what the certain amount is, but for sure, if you or a company is donating $500,000 to an election campaign, that should be, to me, public knowledge. You know, XYZ Corporation donated this much, and therefore then the public, if that party wins, and all of a sudden the public sees XYZ Corporation getting a bigger share of contracts than one would expect, then certainly some questions can be asked. And, you know, perhaps that's when the freedom of information is important. That's when the government in charge has to say, well, yes, XYZ gave us $500,000. And yes, we gave them a lot of contracts, but look, there's a proper tender and they had the best tender. So they just had the opportunity like everyone else to tender. But as Verla did say, there are the financial rules which government has, which require a certain amount of bids for anything over a certain sum. And I can't remember the exact amount, but it might be as low as $50,000. But the loophole is that you can circumvent those financial rules in if it's an emergency situation. And of course, you could determine what is an emergency and not. So it could end up being a very big loophole. But yes, the private sector has a big part to play in the integrity. And there are unfortunately people out there in the private sector who will say to me privately, well, I don't like to pay a bribe, but if I don't pay this bribe, you know, I'm not even getting to quote on the contract, or I'm not getting a license or whatever. So there, you don't have to do it. Let me just say, because our company, we've never paid a bribe and you get through. And I think people respect you for that. Perhaps sometimes you take a little longer to get through than you feel you should. But I would just say that to everyone out there, you do not have to pay a bribe. The system will work. Maybe it will work a little slower for you because you did it the correct way, but it will work. I would like to throw out here, though, how we might look at financing political campaigns, which tend to happen every 5 years. So to me, there is also a role for the public purse to cover some of those costs. And I don't know what the cost is, but if every 5 years, and also currently it's an odd situation because normally there are two political parties in Barbados that you could clearly say one is in opposition. Right now, of course, Reverend Joseph Atherley is the official opposition. And I'm sure at the Democratic Labour Party, you dispute whether he really commands that many people. But if you were to say, for argument's sake, every election, any political party is given a grant of something substantial, like $1 or $2 million to run the campaign, but you know, you're going to be required to account for how you spent that money. And if you can't account for it, then you have to give it back. I think something like that would do two things. It would, one, make the parties less reliant on private donations, which may not always come from the sources that they would prefer to accept the money from, but they may see no choice but to take the money even though they really don't want to. So this way they would have money with less strings attached, but it also would have a discipline where they would then have to account for how they spent the money. And I think that would start to tighten up the whole way we do elections in Barbados.
Thank you so very much, Andy. Mr. Peiza, you would have touched a little bit on the private sector role early in our discussion, but I'm going to give you the opportunity here to expand on your thoughts on the role of the private sector in integrity, upholding integrity in Barbados, and pretty much having transactions between government and private sector which are corruption free.
Thank you. It really is a starting point that I had before, and that is that integrity is something that is innate. A company is a legal entity, doesn't have a heartbeat, but it is always fronted by people. People are making the decision within that organization, and it is incumbent upon them to raise the standard of that organization to the point that Andy speaks of, where you simply refuse to participate. The difficulty at present in relation to the existing legislation is that it it is not backed up by any whistleblower legislation, and you can't, as you would know, wearing your legal hat, you need somebody complaining, because there has to be evidence brought forward. Also, it speaks both of those who receive and those who give. So they're equally culpable before the law. And what that says in the absence of whistleblower legislation is that everybody going down together. What that generally means is that everybody's standing up together. Okay. Yes, companies themselves have to conduct their business with integrity. And especially when we are dealing with public-private sector partnerships, I think the electorate want to see that there is that transparency, the ledger that Andy was speaking of, that you could see who, well, first of all, let's see the tender ad in the newspaper, and then let us see who answered and what their bids were, because there is that constant concern that we keep seeing the same players all the time coming out of the private sector, when we are aware that there are other players in that space as well. And especially in an economic climate like the one that we are experiencing now, where government has to be a driving force for employment, not just in creating employment directly, but in creating the space where businesses can operate and create employment. It would make more sense to be spreading the jobs around as opposed to seeing the same players all the time. So to have companies insist, because we can have more than one lobby. We can lobby from the outside to have change, but if it is that the impacted business houses are also lobbying for the change, it makes the cry louder. It makes the Jiminy Cricket on the shoulder that much more insistent, to the point where, you know, we see it all the time in politics. If the lobby that is the loudest is the one that gets heard. So if the private sector, to a man, put their foot down and say we are not participating in this, we would get some headway as well. But there has to be push coming from all sides. I'm not going to put that burden on the private sector alone. Those of us who are playing in the political arena have to hold ourselves to high standards and hold each other to high standards as well. So it has to be everybody, because whether we like it or not, the populace looking on has a certain expectation, and whether that expectation is high or low depends on how we project ourselves. So if it is that the electorate has a low opinion of politicians, politicians are the only ones who can change that viewpoint. If it is that they have a low opinion of certain companies, those companies are the only ones who can change that viewpoint. And we have to do it in a deliberate way. I don't think that that we can creep towards it anymore. I think we have to boldly step out and make that change. We have to determine that we want to do things differently and better. And that is why I don't want it just to be a conversation about what about the companies, because yes, they have a role to play, but that is not in any way to diminish the role of the civil servants, of the politicians, of the wider community, that we set that standard, that bar high enough for each other, that we are the gatekeepers.
Thank you, Madam President. And I want to take this time to thank the team, the Sunday team roast, for feeding me with the questions. And at this time, we will go into some of the questions from our Facebook Live viewers. Thank you for following, and good evening to each and every one of you. The first question is from Christina, and this is to you, Madam President, and this naturally is following up from your contribution, your last contribution with regards to politicians and their roles going forward with integrity and going away from any attempts to corruptions with the private sector. Christina on Facebook, she asked, will the Democratic Labour Party commit to a code of conduct for its candidates and agents in the next general election when it's called? Mr. Peiza?
I'm glad you asked that. I'm not really sure why I didn't mention it earlier, because one of the reasons, and I know that a lot of the political pundits are saying, oh, you haven't named your candidates, you haven't named your candidates. But one of the things that we did first, early o'clock, was critically analyze how we choose those who front for the party. So we spent some time, and it took nearly a year simply because we wanted to have the membership involved in the process. So we had a candidate selection process conceived, deliberated, debated at council levels, and then we took it to annual conference so that our larger membership could have input into what we were going to be looking for in candidates. And it is only after we had that process crystallized did we start the process of looking for candidates, because we wanted to be certain that who we put before the public could pass muster and scrutiny. I am not speaking in terms of propaganda and innuendo. You always have to fight that down in the public space. But I am speaking in terms of getting to the nitty-gritty, doing due diligence, not just that someone wishes to run or that they are popular in either a national context or in a colloquial sense, or that they have a parish presence. It is not just that, but an investigation into what they have done with their lives to this point, looking to see, I'm not telling you you're going to find everything, but at least to know that we have gone through that rigorous process with everybody. And I was not kidding when I said, including me. I had to face the panel too, including me, that we have at the end of the exercise a slate of candidates that we can confidently face the public with and defend. Everybody has something or the other in their life that they regret. But does it reach to that point where we have to question their integrity and their standing? That is something completely different. And that really is what we were looking for, that we have candidates that we can confidently present and represent. And I will go further and say that our candidate selection process has an element of recall built in, precisely because you can miss something. And if it raises its ugly head at some point, we know will not be scrambling to figure how to deal with it. We have put a process in place that we would be able to deal with it. God forbid that it ever happens, but that we would have a mechanism already in place. Now, all pieces of legislation and bylaws included are as good as they are on paper until they are tested. And I have no doubt that at some point in time they will be tested. But what we can assure the public of Barbados is that we have changed the way in which we do things. We have including going on the ground in the constituency and asking questions. Then it was as intrusive as that, to understand how this person is viewed amongst the very people that they're looking to represent. And having done that, I do believe, Christine is the name, that we can
Yes.
say with a high degree of confidence that the candidates that we have so far will pass muster. I will segue only to say that we have most of them in place, and that the ones who are coming after, will also be going through this same process. And again, the intention is that we present a panel of integrity to the people of Barbados.
So thank you very much, Mr. Peiza. Going forward, Christina, to answer your question in summary, Mr. Peiza has indicated that Democratic Labour Party in this election process is following a code of conduct, and also in the coming election, they expect that candidates will follow the said code of conduct in conducting business and going forward pursuing to be selected members of parliament. I have another question from former senator, and I believe he was announced as the Democratic Labour Party candidate for St. John, Andre Worrell, to the full panel, that is. So he will let Mr. Armstrong answer this question first. Who should have the responsibility to enforce these legislations and create the regulations? Do we leave it to the political parties to regulate themselves, or should we have an independent body? Mr. Armstrong, you want to take a
Sure.
question? Let's go
Well,
ahead.
thank you for the question, Andre. To have someone, you need to self-regulate to a point, but I think there needs to be an independent body who will make sure that this is the parties you were talking about, legislating, making sure the parties comply, was it?
Yes, correct.
Yes, okay. So right now, though, again, correct me if I'm wrong, we have election. When we have elections, we have an election board.
Electoral Boundaries Commission, yes.
Yeah, the election commission who makes sure that the parties comply with the current laws. So, if we're envisaging something like that, and that commission is supposed to be independent, that structured to be independent, but you always have a problem if the persons who are appointed to that commission primarily come from the ruling party. There's then going to be certainly a temptation, and again, I'm not saying that they're not independent, but it's much better off to have a wider pool of persons on those, whichever body we look to regulate. And yes, political parties need to have a seat at the table because they're the ones being regulated, but it needs to be wider than that. Perhaps someone from the business sector, the trade unions, the church. You need to have a wider panel of persons who are going to be regulating.
Thank you, Andy. And Ms. Peiza, is the Electoral Boundaries Commission is good enough as the body to regulate the election process? Do you agree with Andy, who indicated that we need a wider reflection of Barbadians on the board I'm representing? Mr. Peiza, your thoughts?
I'm going to say no, they are not sufficient, and I'll give examples coming out of the by-election.
Great, go ahead.
During the by-election, there was an incident at the Lower Estate dump, and certain statements were made. And first, it was indicated that it was an official gathering, and then it was indicated that it was a political gathering. The position was publicly made that if it were a political gathering, then it was in breach of the rules. And I haven't heard the Electoral and Boundaries Commission pronounce on it yet, okay, at all. A single moment. Not so much in the by-election, but definitely in elections gone by. We who were involved in elections would receive stories from people on the ground of money passing hands, and on election day, people electioneering within the white lines and things of those nature. And you would call, you make a report, and I am yet ever to hear that the Electoral and Boundaries Commission has even investigated, never mind pronounced upon. So I will boldly say that the commission is not sufficient, and that its very composition makes it inefficient for that purpose, because it has representatives on it from the two political parties, and I don't believe it is written anywhere, but you can almost imagine the thought process of today for me and tomorrow for you. I like to speak plainly, okay? I am not saying that that is what is done, but I am certainly seeing that nothing is done, despite all the stories that you hear on the street, and you hear them with sufficient rapidity and repetition that you figure there has to be some nugget of truth in it, but you will never know if no one examines, and no one examines. So we do need to have, I don't believe in recreating anything. We have the police there to enforce laws. And perhaps if they were the body that had the authority to enforce this other law, we may get somewhere. Let's face it, they're present at every political event. They have to see things as well. They have to know things as well. So maybe if we went that route, and with some seriousness, I seem to recall it was in 2018 election where there was some scandal in relation to ID cards and taking a picture and things of that nature, you know, and you had all of this ventilated in the public space and then ashes. So if we are going to do it, if we are serious about it, then let us give it the same. Let us treat it like what it is, and that's criminal activity. And let those who have the power to deal with criminal matters get on with the job. That's how I feel about it. We don't need to create any new agency for it. I understand the Anti-Corruption Unit and why you would think that the police don't have the manpower for it, but we thought so before in relation to fraud and white collar crimes, and the police then started sending officers to study financial topics, and they managed to man that financial investigations unit. And I believe that we could do it. I don't think that we're going to have that much business that we need a whole new unit. Let the police do the job that the police have been instituted to do.
Thank you so very much, Madam Peiza. I'm getting another question here. I believe it is, give me a second. from Broom. Should there be a public document that outlines the contracts and the value of the contracts issued to the private sector in Barbados? Should this be a part of the Freedom of Information Act? Andy, you would have touched briefly on this. Your thoughts on the question, and I think you would have pretty much addressed this previously, so I'll give this question to you firstly.
Yes, I completely agree that there should be. The data should be there to show, as Verla said, you know, the tender went out, we had these people tendered, we chose this one, and the criteria, because you don't always choose the lowest bidder, but if you don't choose the lowest bidder, then it really is important to explain why you didn't choose the lowest bidder. What I could say is there are some agencies, the Barbados Drug Service is pretty good on this, because it's every 2 years now they have a tender to supply pharmaceuticals to the Barbados Drug Service. And they used to publish first physically and then digitally. They would publish everyone who had tendered and the price they tendered at and who was awarded. So, and that was great for the transparency, but it was also very good for the government to keep prices down, because you know, if you sell a particular product and you didn't get the contract this time around, but you could see that someone else got it by bidding a certain price that was lower. If you were able to get to that price, you know, next time around, you're going to cut your price to try and get the contract. So it was very successful for a time in driving down prices. Right now, it's not published, but you can request it from the Barbados Drug Service. And as far as I'm aware, they will make that information available. But it shouldn't only be one agency within the government. Certainly, Ministry of Transport and Works. There are a number of agencies that spend a lot of money every year, and it would be important to have that information on a website, is what I would say, where people can go and dig around and ask questions. So the more information you have out there, I think the more transparent a society we will have, and the better governance will come out of it. And coming back to your topic, the more prosperous a Barbados we will have, because the money will be spent on the right things and not on the wrong things.
Thank you so very much, Andy. Mr. Peiza, I'll give you a chance to answer that question as well. Do you agree with Andy in his thoughts?
I do, yes. It is part of the Freedom of Information drive. At the end of the day, those of us who come to public office need to start thinking about it in a different way. It is not that we have come to office, but we have come to service. And if you keep that at the forefront of your mind, then you will know that you have to account, because it is not about you. It is about who you are servicing. And especially in a small economy like Barbados, we really can't afford infelicities. We simply cannot afford wastage of any type. And if it is that you know that the process has to be as public as that, then I think there is a disincentive to do wrong. So, and I agree that not every low bid is the best bid. If for those of us who have built houses, you may learn the hard way that the person who lowballs also understands what a cost overrun is. So at the end of the day, they may end up being the most expensive person. So you do have to have an analysis of the bids. And if it is that you think that a bid has been lowballed, then you say that and we're not asking for a sermon in your report. We're not asking for a dissertation or a legal opinion. It doesn't have to be a long document, but some justification. X was chosen because of Y reason. Okay. And in those instances where you have to say why someone was not chosen, that you also say that as well.
Thank you so very much,
I
Verla.
find that not very many people even want to check the register, but the fact of its existence should be enough of a check and balance.
Thank you. We really had an excellent conversation here this evening, and I really want to thank both of you, Andy and Verla, for the discussion so far. That is the end of our questions from Facebook. As we wrap up, I think the audience really want to know, where do we go from here, right? And with regards to integrity and governance, what is the immediate actions and what is the vision for the future of Barbados, to pretty much, as we go back to our topic, to ensure a prosperous Barbados? These are wrapping up comments, and I'll open to you, Andy, firstly, and then over to you, Verla.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you upfront for inviting me to be part of this panel tonight. I very much enjoyed it and having the opportunity to share our commitment to integrity and good governance within Barbados. So where do we go from here? As we know, we have an election due within 2 years, and the Prime Minister could call it sooner. But before the next election, we would really like to see some of this legislation, well, some more, because there's been 1 or 2 pieces that have been passed. But it would be very important to see the Prevention of Corruption 2021, which I know has had comments. It would be important to have that one passed. The Integrity in Public Life, which is the one that failed last year. I know the Attorney General had said publicly he was going to come and tweak a few things and bring it back to the House. So very much we'd like to see that one passed as well. There is whistleblower legislation somewhere, and that one is not particularly contentious, so we would hope that that one could also be passed. The other 2 which would love to see is the freedom of information. I'm not aware that anything has been drafted yet, but for me that would be an important one. And the last one is the one we talked about, some form of campaign finance reform. And perhaps that one doesn't need to be overly complicated. As Verla said, for sure political parties should have some form of registration and should be made to account for the funds, not only for the sake of the whoever is looking on to receive it, and it doesn't necessarily have to be out there for everyone to see, but there certainly should be a panel at the very least that would be able to regulate the political parties and make sure that they've done everything that they should have done. But for themselves, it's very important. And coming back to the Caribbean Court of Justice ruling, I think that one is very important before the next election, because that one is a huge big question mark hanging over what could happen in the next election and what could happen if someone challenges it.
Thank you so very much, Andy. And over to you, Mr. Peiza, for the closing comments on the way forward and what the next steps pretty much to ensure that there's a prosperous Barbados, corruption-free.
Yes, the 3 that to my mind are critical, well, 4, but 1 is overarching. So let me speak about that one first. None of this works without the whistleblower legislation, because we can put whatever it is we like in place. If we don't have the safeguard for those people who wish to raise their hand and say, I saw something, I know something, If we do not have the safeguard for them, they are simply not coming forward. So that is a must. We have to have the whistleblower legislation in place. And because it is the easiest of them, I think we should just get on with that one. And don't leave it till the end. Just get on with that one. But integrity in public life, because it doesn't only touch and concern on politicians. We're talking about it in that context. But we need to clean up the civil service as well. We need to, and I'm not just talking about bad apples in inverted commas. I am talking about bad practices. I'm talking about simply doing things the right way. And we need to have the integrity in public life legislation, or whatever name you choose to call it. We need to get that in place. It should include the judiciary. We be making a mistake. I mean, we can always add them in later if that becomes a sticking point, but we should include the judiciary, because the first of all, our justice system takes so many body blows already that we don't want anyone to land an uppercut in relation to any integrity issues. Let's deal with it before it becomes an issue. Don't wait for something to become an issue. So the judiciary definitely should be included. We know that senior civil servants will be included. And as a must, anybody bringing themselves to public life, whether it is as an MP or on a board of directors of a state-owned entity, they all should be vetted. I am definitely in favor of that. We need to have, for transparency, the freedom of information legislation in place. But for me, the utmost imperative, because we now have legislation pushing, the utmost imperative is campaign financing. We must have that in place before the next elections, so that we don't run afoul of the CCJ, and so that more of our people who bring themselves to public office do not find themselves in any liability, whether it is here or overseas. That is a critical positioning from the Democratic Labour Party, that reform of campaign financing needs to be regularized as a matter of urgency, and the timetabling that we are suggesting and promoting is before the next general election.
Thank you so very much, Madam Peiza. So that, guys, viewers, that brings us to the end of our Senderos, the Democratic Labour Party Senderos. Pretty much thankful for the opportunity to moderate today's program. I want to thank the viewers and Team Rose for putting this package together. I want to thank Mr. Andy Armstrong for joining us today, and as always, the President of the Democratic Labour Party, Mr. Verla Peiza, for both of them to put in their positions and their organizations' positions on integrity in Barbados and meaningful discussions. They will propose a lot of changes which ought to be within the laws of Barbados and the way forward. As I said, I'm Curtis Cave, the former president of the Young Democrats. Thank you for being here with us, and good evening.
Thank you, Curtis.